Lawrence Welk smiled on camera for 27 years straight. He built a $150 million fortune while paying his performers $110 a week. He fired a woman for showing her knee. He hid pregnant singers behind baby carriages. And when a stalker murdered one of his star's fathers in a parking lot, the show barely missed a beat. Behind those champagne bubbles was a man who controlled everything. What his performers did, what they wore, who they could marry. The stories they never told will change how you see that friendly grandfather forever. 1. Star pay. The biggest contradiction in Lawrence Welk's career showed up in the paychecks. Every performer on the Lawrence Welk show was paid union scale. That meant the lowest amount allowed, no matter how famous or important they became. There were no special contracts and no long-term security. Anyone could be replaced at any time. Welk even discouraged performers from hiring agents or managers, saying outside help only made negotiations harder. So most of them stayed quiet and accepted what they were given. The actual numbers tell the story. Kathy Lennon of the Lennon sisters said they worked at group scale for 10 years, earning only $110 a week. Later, they were moved up to solo scale at $210 a week, and that is where it ended. When the sisters asked for double scale, which still would have been small money for performers watched by 30 million people every week, Welk refused. He told them no act was worth a penny over scale. Peggy Lennon later admitted that after decades on television, none of them had much money saved. While his performers lived modestly, Welk was quietly building a fortune. By 1970, he owned 16 music publishing companies and controlled the copyrights to 4,600 songs. That included the entire Jerome Kern catalog, which he bought for $3.2 million. He built the 21-story Lawrence Welk Plaza in Santa Monica, the tallest building in the city at the time, and sold it in 1987 for $73 million. He also developed a 1,000-acre resort near Escondido that became one of Southern California's most visited attractions after Disneyland, bringing in 40,000 visitors each month. Over the years, his publishing empire grew to include 27,000 copyrights from more than 100 companies. That catalog alone sold for $25 million in 1988. Long after his death, the family sold the resort properties for $430 million. When Welk died in 1992, his personal fortune was estimated at $150 million. Welk always defended the system. He said that appearing on national television gave musicians exposure that led to concert bookings and record deals. Many performers did stay for years, with the average run lasting about 9 seasons. Still, the gap between what he paid and what he earned remained hard to ignore. 2. Champagne. Lady Alice Lon became the original Champagne Lady in 1955 after winning a nationwide audition. She was lively and confident, and audiences loved her right away. For 4 years, she was one of the most familiar faces on the program. Then, in July 1959, everything changed when Welk suddenly fired her. The reason sounded almost unbelievable. During one musical number, she sat on a desk and crossed her legs, showing what she later described as only a small amount of knee. Welk decided the moment went too far and declared that cheesecake did not belong on his show. Lon could hardly believe it. She said she had only sat down the way any lady would. Even by the standards of that time, her outfit was described as extremely modest. Viewers reacted quickly. Thousands of letters poured in demanding that she be brought back. Welk eventually offered to rehire her, but by then, Lon had made up her mind. She had already been asking for better pay and more modern songs, and she chose not to return. The two later made peace on a personal level, but they never worked together again. Lon recorded an album and appeared on other television programs. yet she never regained the same level of fame. She died in Dallas in 1981 at the age of 54. The incident showed how tightly Welk controlled every detail of the program, from wardrobe to music choices. Norma Zimmer replaced Lon on New Year's Eve 1960. She was first told she would stay only until another singer was found, yet she remained for 22 years. The quiet stability suited Welk's style, and performers who accepted his rules often lasted the longest. 3. Dark tragedy. The darkest story connected to the show came from the Lennon sisters' sudden fame. Diane, Peggy, Kathy, and Janet debuted on Christmas Eve 1955 after Welk's son heard them singing at home and encouraged them to audition. Their simple harmony songs turned them into national favorites almost overnight. They were still children when millions of viewers began watching them every week. One man took that attention too far. His name was Chet Young, a former Air Force officer who had been declared dangerously insane. He became convinced that he was meant to marry Peggy Lennon and believed her father stood in the way. William Lennon was a milkman who later became a golf instructor and a respected member of the Santa Monica community. To Young, he became an enemy. Threatening letters arrived for months. Police were aware of the situation and even contacted federal authorities after Young sent a strange message about marrying one of the sisters. Still, no one expected what happened next. On August 12, 1969, Young waited in the parking lot of the Venice golf course where William Lennon worked. Witnesses later described a short argument that ended in terror. Lennon tried to run for safety while Young fired his gun. The first shot struck him as he ran. Another hit him in the back as he reached a fence. Then Young walked up and fired a final shot at close range. Later, the sisters found a letter at their father's home. Inside was a photograph of him with a gun pointed at his head and a single message that read, "High noon," the exact time of the murder. The sisters and their families were placed under round-the-clock police protection. 2 months later, Young was found dead in the trunk of an abandoned car, surrounded by Lennon's sisters' magazines. He had taken his own life and left a note describing how he had waited hours before the shooting. The tragedy shook the family deeply and changed the course of their careers. They had just begun filming their own television program when the murder happened. Future episodes were recorded on closed sets, and the show lasted only a short time. Welk reportedly felt responsible in a personal way, believing he had helped bring the sisters into a level of fame that exposed them to danger. 4. Strict rules. Welk's personal beliefs shaped the lives of his performers in ways that went far beyond music. He was a devoted Catholic who attended Mass daily, and he expected the same moral standards from everyone around him. That influence reached into private matters and sometimes created awkward situations. When the married Lennon sisters began having children, Welk tried to keep their pregnancies hidden from viewers. On stage, they stood behind fences, counters, baby carriages, and other props that blocked the camera's view. Instead of celebrating family life, the show treated pregnancy as something that should stay out of sight. At one point, Welk reportedly warned the sisters that they showed too much pregnancy, and even criticized their swimwear during a poolside segment. Other performers remembered similar control. Singer Helen Ramsey recalled that Welk sometimes appeared at restaurants just to see what cast members were doing. Once she wore a strapless dress on stage, and Welk reacted with alarm. During a break, he taped the dress into place before letting her return to perform. His beliefs also affected the men in the band. Trombonist Barney Little had played with Welk since 1948, but when he announced plans to remarry after a divorce, he was dismissed. Welk told him that remarriage would be living in sin. Only after several band members argued that Liddell's private life had nothing to do with his music, did Welk agree to bring him back. The call came on Liddell's wedding day. In his autobiography, Welk described his management style in ways that sounded almost parental. He admitted that he sometimes disciplined performers like children, and that the women in the cast could soften his decisions with tears. To him, the show was a family, and he acted as the father, whether the performers wanted that role or not. 5. Lone dancer. Arthur Duncan joined the program in 1964 and became its only black regular performer. Hiring him took courage at a time when segregation still shaped much of the country. Several Southern stations threatened to drop the show rather than broadcast his appearances, yet Welk kept him on the cast. Even so, the limits of the time were clear. During large group numbers where the white performers danced together, Duncan often appeared slightly apart from the others. He worked hard to avoid looking connected to any of the women on stage. Only many years later did he begin performing full routines with female cast members as social attitudes slowly changed. Duncan never spoke badly about Welk. He said he was treated fairly and never felt open hostility. He believed that many Southern viewers accepted him out of respect for Welk himself. During those years, he appeared on television more often than most black entertainers, and dancer Gregory Hines later said the program helped keep tap dancing alive when few other shows featured it. Still, Duncan remained the only black regular performer for 18 years until the series ended in 1982. The show presented a very narrow picture of American life. Welk's musical family looked warm and welcoming on screen, yet it reflected a carefully controlled world that left many people outside the frame. 6. The man who hated spending money. Lawrence Welk's tight grip on money became famous in the entertainment world, and the stories spread from one musician to another until they sounded almost unreal. Wherever the show traveled, people learned quickly that working for Welk meant you should not expect much generosity. Instead of leaving tips in cash, he handed out ink pens printed with the Welk Show logo. At Christmas time, the performers did not receive bonuses. They got souvenirs. One gift that survived tells the story perfectly. It was a small hourglass sealed inside clear plastic, with a tiny tin champagne glass and floating bead bubbles. The Welk logo sat on the front with the message, "To Al Monte from Lawrence Welk, 1956. It looked more like a keepsake from a gift shop than a reward for a year of work. Soon the stories turned into jokes that traveled through the industry. The National Enquirer once reported that Welk handed out cheap neckties at a Christmas party. When he realized one employee had stayed with him for 20 years, he paused for a moment and then proudly announced, "You get 2 ties." Musicians laughed about it for years. Another story came from a week-long engagement at a lake resort. At the end of the job, Welk personally thanked every staff member and gave each person a tiny Hohner harmonica engraved "Compliments of Lawrence Welk." That was the only reward. After the buses pulled away, about 20 harmonicas were thrown straight into the lake. All of this happened while Welk himself was growing very rich. By the 1970s, he lived in the penthouse of his own 16-story luxury apartment building overlooking the Pacific in Santa Monica. His business empire included a 21-story office tower, a 1,000-acre resort, several record labels, and the rights to thousands of songs. He owned so much property in Santa Monica that when just one building at 100 Wilshire Boulevard sold in 1987, the price reached $73 million. Meanwhile, his performers worked without individual contracts, overtime pay, or bonuses. Their future depended on their place on the fever chart Welk kept from viewer letters. If the audience liked you, you stayed visible. If they did not, your screen time slowly disappeared. Some observers tried to defend him. A United Press International obituary later noted that Welk kept many musicians working by paying more than they could earn with trendier bands. For players who might otherwise struggle in small jazz clubs, a steady paycheck and national exposure meant stability. There was even a profit-sharing plan for those who stayed 10 years. Still, the gap between Welk's wealth and his performers' lives was impossible to ignore. 7. The song he did not understand. In 1971, the show produced one of the strangest moments in television history. And it happened because Welk did not realize what he had approved. Singers Gail Farrell and Dick Dale performed Brewer and Shipley's "One Toke Over the Line," a song that radio stations had already been warned about by the FCC because of its obvious drug references. Welk seemed to notice only the mention of Jesus in the lyrics, so he introduced it with a warm smile as "A Modern Spiritual by Gail and Dale." The truth behind the song belonged to a very different world. Songwriter Tom Shipley had taken 3 hits of hashish before a show when only 2 had been suggested. Feeling overwhelmed, he told his partner, "Jesus, Michael, I'm 1 toke over the line." That moment became the seed for a song that turned into a counterculture anthem. Seeing it performed on the most wholesome television program in America was instantly unforgettable. Viewers could hardly believe what they were watching. Brewer and Shipley loved it. Mike Brewer later called the performance absurd and admitted it gave them more publicity than they could have bought. Gail Farrell never clearly explained whether she knew the real meaning. Over the years, she turned the mystery into part of her stage act. The moment captured something essential about Welk. He lived inside a carefully protected world where bright melodies mattered more than hidden meanings. And because of that, the entire counterculture slipped onto his stage without him noticing. His misunderstandings did not stop there. Welk often mixed up words in ways that puzzled the people around him. He once introduced songs from World War I as "songs from World War I." While directing accordionist Myron Florin, he said, "You go over there and play the accordion. I'll stay here and beat off the band." When a stage turned out to be too small, he ordered a stagehand to fire 4 feet of the band. Much of this came from his background. Welk left school after the 4th grade and spoke with a thick German-Russian accent. Tutors helped him soften it, but he kept part of the accent because audiences liked it. His staff learned to interpret what he meant rather than what he said. Sound mixer Dick Wilson spent more than 30 years on the show and collected dozens of sayings. Welk described rock music by saying, "That's not my cup of dish." After proposing an idea, he once said, "I just had an idea that went right over my head." When directing a guitarist to support a singer, he gave the uneasy instruction, "Get behind her over here and give her a nice feel." Each moment showed how far Welk stood from the changing culture around him. Yet his audience loved him for exactly that reason. 8. The music had limits. When New Orleans clarinetist Pete Fountain left the show in early 1959, he summed up his experience in a single line that musicians still repeat. "I left the Welk show because champagne and bourbon don't mix." The trouble reached a breaking point during the 1958 Christmas special. Fountain played Silver Bells in a lively jazz style that reflected his Dixieland roots. Welk listened and grew angry because every piece on the program had to fit his smooth champagne sound. For Fountain, it felt like the end of a long struggle. Years of trying to keep his own style alive under Welk's direction had worn him down. Welk often reminded performers that they had to play what ordinary people understood, and Fountain finally decided that was not enough. The singers felt the same pressure. Kathy Lennon later explained how frustrating it became as the group grew older. They wanted to sing newer and more mature songs, but Welk believed the audience would not understand music by the Beatles or Stevie Wonder. The result felt embarrassing at times. Lennon remembered skipping around stage decorations and singing "Here Comes Peter Cottontail," while friends back home were listening to modern music. Welk controlled every detail of the show. Viewer letters were turned into the fever chart that shaped each performer's future. He decided what they wore, what they sang, and how they stood on stage. Song lyrics were carefully checked for anything suggestive. Comedians were never hired because their jokes might cross the line. Cigarette and beer advertising never appeared. Still, not everyone felt trapped. Fountain later admitted that Welk taught him valuable lessons about discipline and running a band. Dancer Bobby Burgess, who stayed from 1961 until 1982, believed Welk understood his audience better than anyone. For performers who wanted steady work and national exposure, the arrangement made sense. But for artists who wanted freedom, the Welk show felt beautiful and secure on the outside, while quietly limiting everything inside. Many stayed, some walked away. Either way, the champagne style always came first. 9. Dark Fates after Welk, the clean and cheerful world. Lawrence Welk showed on television hid lives that were often far more complicated behind the scenes. Viewers saw smiling performers who felt like part of a safe and friendly musical family. Yet once some of those performers stepped away from Welk's world, their lives took painful turns that shocked the same audience that once adored them. Joanne Castle was one of the brightest personalities on the show. She joined in 1959 and quickly became known for her lively ragtime piano and warm stage presence. But around 1969, Welk dismissed her after publicity surfaced that he felt damaged the image of the program. After leaving the show, Castle's life slowly unraveled. Addiction took hold, and she struggled with alcohol and prescription drugs for years. Then, in 1978, a terrible situation brought even more pain. Her fiancé, William Austin Holloway, was charged with molesting one of her children. Castle tried to protect him and forced the child to write a letter denying the abuse. That decision led to a conviction for perjury. Decades later, in a 2013 deposition, she admitted what she had done and said she had been brainwashed at the time. Bob Ralston had seemed just as dependable on screen. As the show's pianist, he was part of Welk's carefully protected musical family image. That image collapsed in 1984 when he was arrested for molesting a 13-year-old piano student. 2 years later, he pleaded guilty to a felony count involving a lewd act with a child under 14. For many longtime viewers, the news was deeply upsetting because the gentle musician they thought they knew was nothing like the man revealed in court. Other performers faced quieter hardships that never made the same headlines, but still left lasting marks. Natalie Nevins had impressed Welk enough to be hired over the telephone in 1965. Her time on the show ended suddenly in 1970 after she missed a single live engagement. Larry Hooper, the beloved bass singer, lived with constant health problems caused by heavy smoking. Throat cancer forced him to undergo surgery that removed part of his voice box, and in his final years on the program, he silently mouthed the songs while recordings played in the background. Tanya Phelan entered the Welk family itself when she married Welk's son, Larry Jr., in 1968. Life inside that circle was tense from the beginning because Welk disapproved of the rock band at their wedding reception and disliked many of their lifestyle choices. The strain never really eased. She left the show in 1977, and the marriage ended 2 years later. Even Alice Lawn, once known as the Champagne Lady, had lived through terror long before she was dismissed from the show. On June 13, 1955, 3 masked men forced their way into her North Hollywood home. They beat her, tied up her family, and took compromising photographs to use as blackmail. It was a frightening attack that received little attention at the time, and Welk's publicity machine made sure it faded quietly from view. Taken together, these stories reveal a darker side to the polished world audiences believed in every Saturday night. The music sounded joyful, and the smiles looked sincere, but many lives behind the curtain were filled with struggle. 10. The Welk family feud. For decades, Lawrence Welk promoted the idea of a musical family built on harmony and loyalty. In the end, the deepest conflict unfolded inside his own family, turning the Welk empire into the setting for a painful legal battle. Lawrence Welk Jr. had always been prepared to carry on his father's work. Born on March 11, 1940, he even shared the same birthday as Lawrence Welk himself. Over time, he rose through the company and became CEO of the Welk Group in 1980. He would lead the business for 42 years, guiding the organization that grew out of his father's television success. Then, everything changed in November 2022. His own son, Kevin Welk, and his nephew, Jonathan Fredericks, called a special board meeting and pushed through a rule stating that no one older than 74 could serve as CEO. Larry Jr. was 82. Soon after, the board eliminated the CEO position entirely and placed Fredericks in charge as president. Larry Jr. was removed without any severance package, ending a leadership career that had lasted more than 4 decades. The conflict turned into a public fight on January 20, 2026, when Larry Jr. filed a $30 million lawsuit in Los Angeles County Superior Court. The complaint described betrayal in dramatic terms and claimed that after building the careers of his son and nephew, he had been pushed aside by the very people he helped succeed. The lawsuit accused Kevin Welk of spending $231,782.07 of company money on an Aston Martin for personal use. The Welk Group responded with its own claims, saying Larry Jr. had taken annual bonuses of $200,000 without approval and used company funds for private jet travel. Kevin Welk spoke openly about the personal pain behind the legal fight. He said that he and his father had once been very close, and that losing that relationship made the situation especially difficult. Former performer Ralna English also spoke out and supported the younger generation, saying the situation broke her heart. Most shareholders agreed with Kevin and Fredericks. 19 out of 21 backed the decision to remove Larry Jr., leaving only Larry Jr. and his spouse in opposition. Lawrence Welk Jr. died on February 11, 2026 at the age of 85, only weeks after filing the lawsuit and before the case could be resolved. The Lennon sisters announced his passing and remembered how his enthusiasm as a teenager helped bring them to the attention of his famous father many decades earlier. In the end, the family that had spent years presenting a picture of harmony to the nation struggled to maintain that same harmony within their own home. Lawrence Welk was never as simple as the friendly grandfather figure audiences saw on television, and he was never fully the harsh taskmaster described by critics either. The truth lies somewhere in between, and that truth makes his story far more interesting. He left school after the 4th grade and still managed to build a business empire worth about $150 million. He did it through tight control, careful decisions, and a strong sense of what his audience wanted at a time when much of television ignored them. He watched every detail and guarded the show's image with determination. Yet he also created a profit-sharing plan that rewarded performers who stayed loyal. His strict moral standards often felt limiting to the people who worked for him, but they came from beliefs he genuinely held, rather than from a calculated performance. The show avoided racial diversity for many years, yet he still took the risk of keeping Arthur Duncan on the program, even when stations in the South objected. Even the famous champagne bubbles tell a quiet story about the man behind the image. At first, the bubbles floating across television screens were made from soap. Musicians complained when the residue began to collect on their instruments, so the machine was changed to use glycerin instead. The adjustment was practical and necessary, and in a small way, it reflects Welk himself. The picture always looked bright and beautiful, while behind the scenes, the machinery kept working no matter what it took. The performers carried much of the burden through limited freedom and modest pay. The audience at home saw only the sparkle. The cost of keeping that sparkle alive remained hidden behind the music.